All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning. We'll say Bonjour. Nikki Paradas Indigenikas, Makwa and Duda, Monamani, Zagi Gang and Dunjaba. She said, hello, I'm Nikki Paradas. I'm Bear Clan from the beautiful Lake Vermilion side of the Flathead Reservation here in northern Minnesota. And I also work at the Center for Indian Country Development. And as you can see, we're here to talk about homeownership in Indian country. And though it says tribal leaders creating the opportunity for choice, and we have one with us here this morning, Chief Executive Melanie Benjamin from the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe, and also contributor of our conference bags, and I was really excited to get one of those. We're also going to be talking about what roles we have in land staff, also other practitioners, in supporting our tribal leaders and getting kind of the message of why homeownership is important, what our place and what our roles are to support it and create kind of an ecosystem in our local communities and economies that make sure that it's possible. And I'll talk about some resources we have, and then we'll also hear from George Ducharme. Did I pronounce your last name right? And he's from the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, and he'll be talking, and he's from the Land Department, and he'll be talking about what their tribe has done compacting those land management functions from the BIA. So I'm really excited to learn from both of them. I've also had the pleasure of hearing Melanie present before on homeownership almost a year ago in her homelands and talking about what Mille Lacs has done to make homeownership possible for their band members, but also for other communities. And I can say that when I worked in my community, I had actually started a credit union, and though we did not offer mortgages, we often referred to Woodlands Bank and their HUD 184 program pretty often because they were incredible in walking our band members through the process. So anyways, the impacts can go far and wide. What I'm gonna get to later is, again, some of our resources, but we're here to talk about homeownership and also kind of the Tribal Leaders Handbook on Homeownership, which was this comprehensive blueprint that the Center for Indian Country Development at the Federal Reserve Bank put together with really a host of partners. We always talk about many hands make light work. So this is a national effort, national production, and if you're interested in getting a hard copy, I'm gonna pass around eventually a really makeshift kind of mailing sheet. You can give me your name, mailing address, and email, and we'll make sure that you get a hard copy. But I think without getting into what always seems to be an obvious question, why does the Federal Reserve care about Indian country? What's their connection? What's their relation? I think I will pass the mic to our panelists to share a little bit more about themselves before we kind of jump into things.
Good morning, Melanie Benjamin, and I'm the Chief Executive for the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe, about 100 miles north, and been Tribal Chair since 2000. Every 4 years I've been elected so I've been very honored to that the people of Mille Lacs have put their faith in me to continue to carry on this responsibility. And so thank you for inviting me, and I have a little disclaimer here. We have a big event in Hennepin County today where the government down there is recognizing Mille Lacs Band and our relationship and how we deal with tribal courts and things of that sort. So I'm going to have to leave a little early, so I apologize. But I didn't want to miss the session with this invite.
Next. Good morning. My name is George Ducharme. I'm from the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes of Flathead Nation in Montana. I'm the LTRO. We were the first nation to compact the LTRO function. The tribes in Montana, the Salish Kootenai, have compacted every function excepting for the superintendent on our reservation. We're pretty proud of that. I was a forester before I am who I am. I worked in forest management for 25 years before I jumped into this ship and been going ever since.
Thank you both. And this is not something we typically do in the middle of a session, but since Melanie does have to leave a little early and I manage our bank's CICD Twitter account, does someone mind taking a quick picture of the three of us before she has to step out so I can have proof that this happened? I'll give you my phone. I know this is a little unconventional. We can sit. Yeah. Maybe my phone, not that I wouldn't want your phone number, but just might be easier. I think so, the circle. Yeah.
I think I took about 6 of them. You want to check?
Perfect.
They all there?
Yeah, we look happy. That's what we want. Yeah. So sorry about that interruption. Thank you for doing that. Appreciate it. I recognize a couple faces from yesterday. I could share about the Federal Reserve System's interest in Indian country. Does anyone remember in just like a few words from yesterday? Why does the Fed operate in Indian country? Anyone want to take a stab at it? Okay, I won't put anyone on the spot. But the Federal Reserve System, I'll give you the truncated version, but they have two primary functions. One is monetary policy, the other is providing for maximum unemployment. And under that maximum unemployment responsibility, they have a community development function. So the Center for Indian Country Development really falls under that community development work to make sure that they're helping support and create vibrant economies and communities in low-income areas, but also underserved areas. And the Minneapolis Fed in particular actually has a lot of legacy work within its district. And the Minneapolis Fed's 9th district includes Minnesota, the Dakotas, Montana, so you're in our district, as well as the upper part of Wisconsin and Michigan. And so within that district, there's 45 different reservations and 45 different nations. So they've been doing research around kind of education, business, and workforce probably the last 20, 30 years. And what they found was this needs to happen in a big way, right? This needs to be stood up with national scale, national awareness, national attention. So in 2015, the Center for Indian Country Development was launched. And when we were looking at kind of what role we would play in this big space, right, of Indian country and economic development, we thought that we would be really best positioned to support it through research and also being able to get hard to access data, which I will give a couple examples later in this presentation, and as well as being kind of a convener. So a hub of conversation where if we're talking about issues, we have just the space and, to be honest, also the cachet to bring together some of the federal agencies, the big lenders, but also tribes and tribal housing entities, community development, financial institutions, and policymakers. So that's where we say in our mission, we support the prosperity of Native nations through actionable research and community collaboration. And again, with that national scope, we're not just looking at the communities that fall under Indian country's kind of statutory definition, but we're also inclusive of our relatives up in Alaska and also Hawaii. So pretty broad and audacious coverage, and I think a pretty broad and audacious mission too. And as we look to support kind of Indian country in their objectives and in their goals, we kept hearing early on that homeownership is important, housing is important, it's a driver of economic development. And I think, I was in a session yesterday afternoon, not at this conference, but actually one we were having at the bank, and some of our tribal housing authorities were saying, we just often have this mindset where we think of ourselves as, being in charge of the public housing stock. And we also think of the Economic Development Corporation as over there. And often we don't see kind of the intersections of kind of our work and how we support our local economies. And sometimes we think, and that came out yesterday in a session, and I see Matt Carriaga here from Ho Chunk, where their tribe had implemented Hearth, how important land staff and the realty divisions are to support mortgage lending and homeownership as well. So we're gonna kind of give you the overview. We'll talk about why homeownership is important. I kind of gave a little bit of an overview already, that it's really connected to economic development. And part of what we keep hearing is that the role of tribal leaders and tribal elected leaders is just integral for really making homeownership happen. I should have maybe done this at the onset, but are there any tribal elected leaders kind of in the room right now? Awesome, thank you. And what communities are you from? Yakima? Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, that's great. You guys have a few people here, right? Just two? Okay. So no, appreciate that and welcome. But there's, an incredibly important role that tribal leaders play. And again, in the session we heard yesterday, it was, we might not have the official role of tribal leader, right? We might not be elected, but what can we do to help carry that message back to our tribal leaders and kind of underscore its importance, but give them tangible examples of what they can do, again, to support this ecosystem that needs to exist for homeownership to happen. And so in, I think, 2016, the Center for Indian Country Development launched this National Native Homeownership Coalition to really kind of do a deep dive, not only in the research, like what does mortgage lending even look like in Indian country, but also how do we tackle some of these big challenges? And they created this working group that focused solely on tribal leaders. Like, how do we connect with them? How do we raise this issue up? Because not all communities are like Salish and Kootenai or Mille Lacs. And so there really is that, again, tribal housing mentality. How do we kind of penetrate that and have a paradigm shift in how we think about housing and homeownership? And so Jason Adams, who was the executive director of the Salish and Kootenai Housing Authority, said, I really think we need like a blueprint for tribes, and not just the tribal leadership, but really our housing entities, also for lenders, to kind of map like this really what can be a really complex process, especially when we're talking about mortgaging on trust land. And there's information on the HUD website, there's information, the BIA website, but it's all scattered. It would be great to have a place that brings it all together, but then also highlights best practices and really underscores what tribal leaders can do, and also tells us what resources are out there, and then gives us tangible examples. So we took that mantle on, and we're a pretty small staff, but again, have a lot of partners. So we created this Tribal Leaders Handbook, and we'll talk a little bit more kind of about what's in it and how it can kind of be used to, as a starting point. It's not the end and be all, but as a starting point for helping transform our communities. I'm gonna keep an eye on time for Melanie. So I'll just spend a couple minutes in talking about kind of this messaging, right? And this paradigm shift in how we think about homeownership. We often look at it in terms of demand, capacity, culture, and community, and resources. And starting with demand, it's kind of challenging kind of a publicly or often shared notion that, our tribal members aren't interested in homeownership. They're just happy with tribal housing. And so there's not really a demand here. Well, we challenge that, and we challenge it with data, where we're actually looking at data from a HUD study that was done just 2 years ago with the Urban Institute. And it's nationally representative. I think it took them 10 years to put this together. And they found that, I think 90% of tribal members living on the reservation, and I think 90% of our tribal renters actually are interested in homeownership. That's a significant part of our population. I don't think we can ignore that, right? So that's challenging that notion. And then when we think about capacity, it also challenges another notion where we hear, well, even if they are interested, they don't have the incomes and they don't have the credit standing to qualify for a mortgage. And maybe, Woodlands Bank could probably push back on that because they do a lot of lending. So, and we look at data that shows where incomes are right now, but also where they're headed. So right now, 40% of on-reservation households are already at the US median. And then we see that it's maybe doesn't sound as optimistic as I think it's going to sound, but in my lifetime, our per capita income is actually going to converge with the rest of the country. And that really challenges the narrative that we always hear that we're poor, right? Tribal members are poor. So we're challenging that because we're seeing differently. So that's not to dispel the realities that we know, but it's also to say there's a trend that's going another way. And in terms of the credit scores, that's another kind of thing that we hear all the time. And in the handbook, we actually have this cool pie graph that looks at some of the Equifax data that the Fed pulled a couple of years ago. And it was looking at credit scores on reservation, and at least half of them are already at prime credit. So they qualify. And then a good segment, I think another 20% were really close. So we're challenging some of those kind of long-held beliefs. And then in many of our cultures and in our traditions, I mean, homeownership was the example. Like I talked to, was it from Acoma Pueblo, Derek Valdo, many know as the CEO of Ameren Risk, and he's also a tribal leader. And I said, your homeownership rate for Acoma is like 86%. What are you guys doing? And I was thinking they had all these mortgage financing relationships and that maybe they were compacting those LTRO functions. And he said, it's the expectation, right? We didn't even build public housing, or very little, and only recently. So what do you do if that's the only option, right? So some of it's also cultural and expectations. And then resources and thinking about how do we maximize these resources. One thing that Jason Adams from Salish and Kootenai talks about is, we have a continuum, a need or a continuum of housing needs. So it goes from low income all the way up to home ownership. And we'll see a video later that talks about kind of how they put programs together and resources together to walk people through that continuum. But they say as soon as somebody steps into home ownership, well, now there's a tribal housing unit that's opened up for low income and family in need. So that's really important, I think, to think about. And before I think I share any more, I just want to make sure I'm not missing any points or any data points. No, I think I covered not all of them that we've researched, but I think the highlights. So before I pass it over to Melanie to talk a little bit more about kind of homeownership and space in Mille Lacs and what they're doing now, did anyone have any questions or want to share anything I might have missed about why homeownership is important or what it can do? Yeah.
Did you gather any statistics and included this information about trends of tribal members moving from urban or other rural areas back to tribal communities and how that correlates with needs for homeownership?
That was a great question. Thank you. What was your name?
Shauna Coons?
Shauna Coons. Okay, I remember and recognize you. So Shauna was saying do we have data that looks at kind of the, not just a commuting pattern, but also the relationship to tribal members moving off-res or on-res. And so HUD in that study did look at that, and what you see is there's this revolving door of people that are living on the reservation in adjacent cities in major urban areas that often come back. So if you wanted a deeper dive to what that looks like across the country, I would suggest taking a look at that. But we hear that, I keep seeing everywhere that like 70% of Native people live in cities. And I'm gonna be honest, I don't know where the 70% comes from, because I think what I saw last was closer to 60%. And that's still a big population, but again, it's not taking into account that revolving door. Because 2 years ago, I lived at Boyce Fort and on the res, and now I live in Minneapolis, but I still have my home there on trust land, and I might move back there in another couple years. So I mean, that dynamic is pretty pervasive. And then what we also do have that's available on the Center for Indian Country Development website is a link to, the Census Bureau has this data tool on the map, and it should cover, I believe, every federally recognized tribe in their reservation commuting workforce. So one example that we point to often is the Crow Nation, because their statistics are alarming, but 70% of their workforce lives in an adjacent city or town. And some of them are commuting like up to two hours one way each day. So we'll talk about kind of the role of our workers, right, in providing housing options for them, and its importance for kind of the local economy. But yeah, there's certainly data that exists that show there's also a demand for housing for folks that don't live here yet, right? It is a challenge, and there's always that chicken or egg questions of like, is it housing or jobs? And I won't debate that right now, but they certainly have to coexist. Yep.
Good morning, Melanie Benjamin. And last year I was invited to be one of the panelists at NFOA, and that's Native American Finance Officers. And they wanted to talk about tribal investments in real estate. And so, of course, all the other panelists were professional investors, and they focused on commercial real estate. But then my approach was really, of course, we do some real estate business as well. But when I think about housing and how that pertains to our tribal members, and then for building that capacity for tribal members to actually own their own homes is also a very important investment priority when you think about that. And of course, the obvious things about home ownership, you want to have a place where you build community. And one of our phrases is Bamadi Ziwin, and it's the good life. So and that means that we want to be able to have safe communities, a place for our kids to grow up, and being a good citizen in our communities. And so the tribal chairman a couple of years ago that hired me as a commissioner of administration, he had a 100-year strategic plan. And a part of that plan was to make sure that we had communities where our people would live, and also at that time that a lot of our elected officials were also our cultural, religious people as well. And we have a ceremony called Big Drum, and that starts, actually this weekend is our first one for the spring in our area, and it happens in fall. And so when I think about those things, that when we have ceremonies, and I think in just across any tribe in the United States, we have ceremonies from birth to death. And I was just thinking about my niece. She wanted to do a naming ceremony for her new baby, but she lived in one of the outer little towns because she really couldn't find a house on the reservation. So she said, "Can I use your house for the naming ceremony?" So I said, "Sure." So, but that really makes me think that if we're talking about our practice of our ceremonies, we do have to have a site. And a lot of those, of course, will be in our ceremonial places or buildings, but also at home. There are ceremonies that have to be done at home as well. And and a lot of times if you live in communities that don't allow the smoking, so if you have, your pipes and different things like that, or you're burning sage, you know how some people say, oh, they're smoking other drugs over there. So, a couple of years ago too, we, just the way our structure is, we have a law enforcement agreement with the local county and for law enforcement. And it's a big issue, but what happened is they said we no longer want the agreement. So we're done with the law enforcement agreement, which meant they didn't recognize our tribal law enforcement officers as real tribal police officers. So to make a really long story short, what it turned out that we became known as a police-free zone. And so there were a lot of drug dealers, gang members that showed up on the reservation. And so in what happened is people got addicted to drugs. They started to not be able to take care of their families. We didn't have any law enforcement to help to get these people off the reservation. So we ended up a lot of places where our kids were in foster care. We had a lot of them, and we've been able to address that issue a little bit as we go along. But when I think about all of those kids that are out there that no longer have that home because of some of these issues, and how that kind of violates our cultural teachings in a sense as well, and why it's so important that all of these aspects are a part of what we are and what we need to do. And so, but what we're finding out through all that negativity, that the people that are kind of saying, I need help and I got to get back on the right track, they're able to do that through the cultural teachings of the tribe. And so that's why that cultural component is so important, and to have a place for that. And we have people stepping up and saying, you know, I want to help, I want to be a part of that. And the other thing, I just hired someone just out of college just recently, and he lived also off the reservation because of he was going to school, but he moved in with his mother. And I asked him, well, where are you living? He said, I moved in with my mother. And I said, miigwech, thank you. Because that meant that his elderly parent now had some help at home. It also meant now that the children had a more of a closer tie and teachings to the cultural responsibilities. So that's very important too, I think, in terms of how we live, because we're a really close-knit community. And so parents and, you know, extended family is very important to have together for that. And so one of the things they talked about, the past chairman had that 100-year plan, and a part of that was that we needed to have a really strong community. So we need to have a bank, we need this, we need that, all of those types of things. And he passed away in office, another chairman came in, and she was very smart in terms, she said, there is a plan already, let's follow it. And so it ended up, we were able to purchase the Woodlands State Bank. And of course, it's the Woodlands National Bank today. It's federal versus state. And so that allowed us to actually teach our folks to have checking accounts, savings accounts, things of that sort. So that was very beneficial as well, even though many probably went to the bank when it was there, but they a lot of times only went for loans or whatever. And in addition to that, we have a gaming enterprise, many tribes do, and it gave us additional revenues. So what we did, and I really pushed hard for that, is what we have is called a net revenue allocation plan. So we took all the revenues that we generated and we put it in certain pots of money across the board. So, by the way, when I think about that, the way we have long-term savings, we have government services, we have permanent initiatives where it helps us build new buildings when we want to. We have a housing initiative allocation. So under that line item is where we build houses, where we have home loan, we have elder programs. And so that's very beneficial, because the other thing we wanted to provide a home ownership opportunity for our members. And before gaming revenues, we used to have under the Bureau of Indian Affairs an allocation, and we would be able to build 5 houses a year. And so we had 3 districts. So District 1, largest district, got 3 houses, and the other 2 districts got 2. So that meant 7 houses a year. And that meant the majority of the people weren't going to get a house. And so we created a housing loan program, and we borrowed the money to our members at 2%. And so a lot of people jumped on that, and we're able to do that. And then we talked about economic justice for some of our tribal members. What about our tribal members that really contribute to the well-being of the tribe? So one of the ways we thought we would assist them is that we eliminated that 2% interest program to zero. So now anyone wanting to borrow money from our housing is program, you get a 0% home loan. And that was, again, to the benefit, because we're not in the business of making money from our members, and we do have economic development projects, like I said, that it's allocated to that. So currently, we funded 370 home loans, and that equated to about $42 million. And we service about 321 home loans, and we still have about 32 million outstanding owed to the band. And it may sound high, but it's not when you think about it for us, because 49% of those loans have been completely paid off. And if we give 35-year mortgages, and that program didn't start to 2004. And so we also do a lot of renovation loans out of that housing initiative allocation. And then we also do elder grants. And that's up to like $50,000 for you if you own your home to be able to do some renovation. So the other part we looked at, because we had a lot of people that, again, lived in Minneapolis, Duluth, wherever here in the state, that felt that they wanted to come back. We had jobs, we had some opportunity, and so they all started moving back and also signed up for the home loan program. And of course, we currently have about 300 people on that list right now waiting. And so a way to be able to not travel large distance for your job if you work at any of our economic development projects is now to go through the Woodlands National Bank through the 184 program. And currently, the Woodlands Bank has been able to close about 185 of these loans in the last year, and that's about 26.7 million. And then of those, 40 of those loans were Mille Lacs Band. And so we look at how do we get that opportunity out to our tribal members, and because I'm one of the long-term elected leaders, that my responsibility is to really provide opportunity for my tribal members, and I go out on a regular basis and ask people, what do you need? And when we do our own surveys, it doesn't matter if you're a youth or if you're an elder. The top two things that kind of float always to the top is we want more opportunity to learn the culture, the language, and the traditions of our tribe. But then also we want housing. And so we're always looking at new opportunities, how to actually provide more opportunities to access the need. And even because we do have this home loan program, we also have people that have defaulted on their loans. So we've had foreclosures, and our goal is not to be really like, okay, you didn't make your payment, you're out. We want to really find ways to we'll do refinancing on these loans and try to get them to catch up. And but that just happens sometimes as well. And so it was interesting about the, we have a little, one of the sites of the bank is right in our grocery store, right in the heart of the reservation. And that's where the biggest activity for the bank is, actually right there. And our members, we have probably about 1,000 of our members that are actually members of her do dealings with our Woodlands National Bank. And I actually have a sister that lives in St. Louis, Missouri. She also has an account at the Woodlands National Bank. So when she comes home, she wants to know she's got a little cash if she runs low from hanging out too much at the casino. So anyway, and when you think about that too, it keeps that money in the community as well. And but because our housing initiative budget is there, and we have, again, housing from low-income elder all the way to home ownership, that our ultimate goal is to really get out of government housing, is to have 100% home ownership. So we have to have a lot, we have a lot of ways to go to be able to make sure everybody has a home. And that there was in the last session I was sitting in where they were talking about a lot of the folks really don't have financial training in how to assume some of that responsibility. And quickly, I got to tell this other story about my niece, the same one that came and uses my house for a lot of things. And she was living in a local town, and she was paying about $600 a month rent for this small 2-bedroom, and she said she needed a bigger place. She's got 6 kids, so she does. But she said, well, here's a place, it's $1,000 a month. And I said, well, can you afford it? Yeah. I said, well, how much are you making? Are you sure you can afford that much more? And so I made her do a budget. And so we went through the budget process, and it ended up that she was $300 a month short to pay her bills currently. And so I said, so what you're doing is you're paying a portion of your bills one month, and then you're going to pay the other portion the next month, so you're always behind. And how are you going to ever catch up? And so you got to look at, what are you doing? How much is your cell phone? And DirecTV was the biggest thing. She actually cut that out, and the kids just look at videos now. But at the end of that little exercise, she was able to see that she was able, if she cut out that big cell phone she had and downsized, and also the DirecTV, and quit buying all her 6 kids a can of pop and a bag of chips every time she stopped at the gas station, she could make it. So, and that's what we face too, is we still have a lot of our tribal members that don't have that concept of financial management and really how to make sure you budget from month to month. And also one of the benefits of home ownership for us too, we have a very small per cap, but people can use that as a direct payment for their housing. So if you're not a really good budget person, at least your housing payment is coming out of that monthly plan. So there's things like that. We try to really work hard with our tribal members just to make sure we give them the opportunity. But even though there's a lot of benefits, there's also those ones that aren't able to meet those expectations. So we as tribal leaders still have a lot of responsibility to make sure that we give them the opportunity to learn some of these as well, and not necessarily be dependent on a small per cap for your living expenses kind of a thing. So.
Yeah, thank you, Melanie. I mean, you can hear what Mille Lacs is doing. I heard a few things that kind of stuck out with me. It's, well, one, it's that the leadership is clearly cares, because she's here today with a busy schedule. But I think setting up the lending, and then having, I think the home buyer education, and then I was taking notes. So if it looked like I was texting somebody, I wasn't. But in just thinking about, also thinking about risk mitigation. So that's something we hear a lot on both sides, not just from lenders, but also from tribes and borrowers themselves. How do we handle foreclosure? And when we talk about the CICD's National Native Homeownership Coalition and our policy priorities, they seem to be the same over the last couple of years, and it's looking at issues around leasing and titling, streamlining the lending process, but then also removing some of that legal uncertainty. And that's certainly a role that tribes have. So there's a conference coming up in May with the National American Indian Housing Council, and one of our coalition members there, who's a tribal attorney out of New Mexico, is going to be looking at talking about how tribes can be, like Mille Lacs, more involved in foreclosures and mitigating them too. So offering refis, and thinking about putting like maybe a loan pool together. And that could be done with kind of several other tribes to make it cost effective. So there's a lot that tribes can do, but I think it's really the willingness and seeing, like you were saying, that holistic picture of its importance. So Melanie probably just has about like 4 minutes. Did anyone have a question for her before she has to leave? Yeah.
Just quickly, did you say you had 0% interest in home loans now?
When we started, we did 2%. We wanted to make it really affordable for folks to actually start home ownership. And as we went along, we were talking about people that are tribal members that are really willing to do what they need to do to make our community good, in a sense. So we said, as a way to say thank you for doing that, at home ownership, you're getting off the governmental service environment, and so we decided that we would give them 0%.
So what kind of delinquency rate for do you have even with that 0%?
We have a little bit. Offhand, I don't know the actual amount, but there are a few. Okay, yeah, 6%. And then we work with people too to actually go and say, you know, you're this far. We'll add another $20 a month for your rent to help you get, you know, your payment to get you going. So we really bend over backwards to try to assist, and you know, yeah.
That is amazing. So everyone's going to start their own bank now, right? Go back to your tribal leaders. And I just got a phone call from someone. Was it yesterday? It might have been yesterday afternoon. They're like, our tribal chairman keeps wanting to start a bank. Can you discourage him from that? Because it's a lot of work and I don't want to do it. I said, no, I think it's a great idea if there's the capacity and there is definitely the demand. There's billions of dollars in unmet demand. So, and mortgages are one industry, but it's also commercial lending too. So anyways, I just wanted to say Chimagwech for taking the time to be here, and thank you for representing us in Hennepin County today. And I'm glad they're putting our flags up. And I was asking you to keep an eye out for my tribe. If they don't have our flag, we need to get that up there. So thank you so much. You know, I won't belabor this slide too much because I think we've covered some of it. And Shauna asked a question about kind of housing and home ownership options for those that live off the res, and talked a little bit about like the multiplier effect, right? Because if you have a large commuting workforce, they're spending their money in those local cities and towns on amenities. And I was at an economic development conference recently where they were talking about tribes that were interested in doing these economic leakage studies. Have you heard of those? Like how much money, how many cents to a dollar is leaving the res in terms of the payroll. So a few tribes have done that. My tribe actually was one, and I think we found that 98 cents to every dollar that was earned on the reservation was being spent off the reservation, which is incredible. And you'd like to think that that's like what's going on in that geography or community, but that's actually pretty standard. We hear about 90% of tribes who have done those studies. And so housing is one huge way. If you have, you know, people that are living at home, they will have a demand for all of these amenities and businesses, and you will see job growth, and that's something we've heard often of tribes that have been able to expand their housing options for tribal members. And we do talk about self-determination. I think I'll leave most of that example to the video we're going to show of Salish and Kootenai, but really, you know, and kind of borrowing from yesterday's session too with Hearth, it's like everything we see about kind of mortgage lending working in Indian country, it happens when tribes are taking ownership, compacting those BIA functions. They're starting their own banks and becoming their own lenders. And while HUD 184 does have criteria and eligibility criteria for borrowers, some tribes are also, if they have the capacity, having home loan programs where they're very flexible with their underwriting. And so really it's just tribes are able to more so have ownership of what their communities look like and what homeownership looks like. So, and I think we'll talk about this a bit later, but tribes certainly have a role too when they're looking at kind of what role they can play in supporting like the infrastructure, putting the residential leasing codes together. The stuff that, I'm gonna be honest, puts me to sleep, but I know it's important. There's a lot of room for self-governance and a role for tribes in that space as well. So there's a lot of reasons that homeownership is important. But despite the demand and despite the capacity that we were talking about, and despite all the reasons why it's a good idea, right? What we're also seeing is that there's not a lot of mortgage lending happening in Indian country, at least not on trust land. So again, those of you that were in the session yesterday, this graph will look familiar, but for those of you that weren't, this graph is showing that HUD 184 loan, and that's, I think, it's not the only mortgage product for Indian country, but it is the most popular, and it was started in 1994 to facilitate lending on trust land. So we know that that can be difficult, right? Because sometimes lenders are worried about, like, we can secure the house, but how do we secure the land if you don't own it? Well, the HUD 184 provides a loan guarantee, so that helps kind of demystify things for lenders and make it feel more safe. But anyways, you can see that that black line, which represents trust land, is almost like a flat line, right? And then the red line just takes off. Yesterday I said 2003, I was wrong. It takes off around 2005. And besides Matt, does anyone know why that red line might take off in 2005? Yeah, without the guarantee, right, there, when you enter a situation like Melanie was describing about foreclosure, it can be a pretty harrowing experience, right? But that red line represents when the HUD 184 loan program was opened up on fee land. And so what we saw through some of the HUD data that we were able to get is that over 90% of mortgage lending is happening off of trust land. Which means, like, for an industry that's like $1.5 billion, that means that's $1.5 billion that's bypassing Indian country. Yeah.
At Mille Lacs, about 95% of our land is fee land that we require.
Yes.
So there's not a whole lot of building going on the trust lands because a lot of the trust lands are set aside for cultural use, hunting, things like that. So a lot of the building is happening on fee lands.
Yeah, he was, what was your name again?
Jim from Mille Lacs.
Jim from Mille Lacs was saying 95% of their lands are actually in fee. And we could go into a whole leasing history, but a lot like before 1955, a lot of lands were turning over into fee because it was easier, right? And because of some of the things we talked about. But there are just some communities that have fee, like some of them have all fee land, right? And then you have communities like Red Lake, which here in Minnesota, it's almost all trust land. And when you look across Indian country, if there's about 75 or 80 million acres of land in Indian country, 60 million of those acres are still in trust. They're trust land. So if you think about it, most of Indian country is trust land. So for this to be happening, right, less than 10% of lending is happening on trust land. That means less than 10% of lending is really happening in most of Indian country, which is pretty significant. I do know for many folks where this program has been just instrumental, like people that live in Minneapolis, they're able to get a fixed rate at like 3.5%, probably a little over 4% now. And it's still a great program, but again, when we think about all that potential, there's a lot of potential. Mortgage lending is still largely an untapped market. So there's still, again, kind of a big case to be made for mortgage lending. And so that's why the center, has taken on this mantle of home ownership, stood up this national coalition, and also put the handbook together. It's how do we demystify some of the lending processes, but how do we also motivate and provide tools so that that black line can closer match that red line. And, you know, this graph or scatter plot will look pretty familiar to folks also if they were in yesterday's session. So maybe I'll open it up again for someone who was in that session. But what is this scatter plot showing? So if the one before said less than 10% of lending is happening on trust land, and you could almost just cheat by looking at the title, what is this graph saying, or scatter plot saying? Yes, thank you. She was saying for those that are being processed, those HUD 184s on trust land, they're happening in the communities that you're seeing on this scatter plot. I mean, they're happening in others, and we weren't able to get every nation, right, because it would get really jumbled here. But we also saw if on average there's a relatively low amount of trust land lending, there are communities where they're seeing a lot of trust land lending. Do you see yourself on this? Yeah.
We do have.
Yeah. Do you want to scoot a chair?
I can move over.
Okay, thanks.
Salish Kootenai, I'll do that again. Salish Kootenai, we do have our own bank, and we have our own tribal credit program that loans on all trust land to only tribal members. So that's why we're out there. Our bank is the one that makes that happen. We have, what do we got? Probably a dozen banks on the reservation, and our tribal bank is the one that is leading the nation in 184 loans, and it's a tribally owned bank.
And I would also tell George not to be so humble, because one other thing that we saw, and we underscored this yesterday, was part of it, again, that picture of, like, so this x-axis are the number of total HUD 184 loans. So you can see Flathead Reservation, which is Salish and Kootenai. You can see they're doing a lot of loans, but then the y-axis is this percentage on trust land. And then I just drew a box around, you know, these communities because we call it the sweet spot. They're doing a good number of loans, and then most of them are on trust land. But with Flathead, it's also what George is going to talk about compacting those functions and basically expediting the mortgage lending process. Because I will say, I have a HUD 184 on trust land, and it took me 2 years to close my loan. And the sole reason for that was because of the lengthy process it took to process all my mortgage documents through our BIA office. So you have removed that kind of lengthy timeline. And of course, that's going to have a big impact on the number of loans you're doing, right? Because, I don't know, 2 years is a long time, so I live doubled up with my grandma and grandpa, then my auntie, and that's great. But if, you know, some people get a little frustrated in that process. So when we look at what tribes are doing, some of the Wisconsin tribes, I'll quickly go back, that you see here, a good number of those also have Bay Bank, which is based out of Green Bay and owned by the Oneida Nation in their backyard. So that does explain a lot of it. But you'll also see like communities like Morongo, and you see Yakima's up there, by the way, upper left-hand corner, a lot on trust land. But you'll see communities that have also compacted some of those land management functions. And what I'd like to do, because I think there's time, but maybe I'll ask first, are people interested in seeing the video of the Salish and Kootenai community? George is shaking his head no, because he's in that video. Play it, okay. So it'll give you an example of what their tribal leadership has done on a number of fronts. He mentioned the bank, also their program, and you'll hear a little bit of George coming up here, so.
Last year at the Montana Affordable Housing Conference, there was a physician that spoke and talked about health conditions in the Indian country here. He said he has a patient, a little 12-year-old boy, he's treated for 5 years. And he said, I could write a prescription to solve, he has asthma. he needs a mole-free house, but the tribe cannot provide it for him. So the family, if they could afford to, would move somewhere where they could live in a house mole-free. Right now, that's not an option for them. That doesn't seem right.
Sukashkukni Nelson Mietki, Hukaklik Ak Arnukam Kutmuku, Huneniksanka Smaknik. The Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes are from the Flathead Reservation, which is 1.2 million acres situated in the northwest part of Montana and on the southern half of Flathead Lake. We have 8,000 tribal members, of which about 5,000, I believe, live on the reservation. One of the major challenges that the tribes have had in the home ownership was being able to secure home loans from larger institutions on tribal trust property.
So we decided to move from tribal housing. We just want a more secure future, know that our girls are going to grow up here and they're going to go to school here in this town. I took a homeownership class put on through the Housing Authority. They go over all the different things like budgeting, see if you can even afford a house. The bank also comes into the homeownership class and they present to just tell us about different kinds of loans, different options that people have. They were available all the time for me to call and ask questions, and you know, I had lots of questions.
The tribal credit program got its start early in the 1940s. The primary purpose for which it started was to allow for ranchers and farmers, the agricultural community, to expand their herds and to expand their operations a bit. Those individuals were allotted lands, but those allotted lands were held in trust by the U.S. government, and so outside institutions were not able to use those lands as collateral or security for the loans. The tribal government then established the tribal credit program, which was able to use those properties as mortgage, and therefore we got a start in lending to individual tribal members. In the 1950s, and that program really expanded into individuals wanting to buy homes, to buy land, to build homes, and that has grown ever since.
The Land Titles and Records Office is responsible for recording documents that affect trust land ownership. We were having a tough time getting things approved, getting them through the Bureau. It was a large time lag from the application to the end product, the mortgage or whatever it is that the end product might be.
Originally, the Salish and Kootenai tribe had to go through the Billings Land Office, but we had a very good local BIA office. We had a very active tribal council. So the BIA was performing about as well as it could under the old rules. Every function of the Bureau on this reservation now is compacted with tribal employees under the control of the tribal council. So the LTRO was just part of that, but everybody that makes a decision now on any loan application was in one location.
We have the superintendent across the street that approves locally our mortgages, our leases, our contracts. So it's all done right here in-house. If there's an error on a document, it's corrected right here. I can walk it across the hall and say, well, you got the wrong ID number here. This guy's enrollment number is. And they can correct it on site. And that just speeds up the process. The regional offices, they've got 40, 50, 60 tribes that they deal with. I deal with one, my people, my land, our land.
The Housing Authority was established by the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes back in 1963. We have 6 departments, we have 70 staff. We are essentially town hall for the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. All services and programs are housed here. After the advent of NAHASDA, to continue our home ownership efforts, decisions made here by our board and our executive director at the time was to establish our own homebuyer program. We titled the program the Flathead Finance Program. And in that program, we provide all kinds of counseling services, down payment assistance, buy down assistance, foreclosure prevention, a match savings program. Our partnership with NeighborWorks Montana has created opportunities for us for home ownership education classes. A lot of folks, get set up in a generational kind of situation where grandma lived in rental housing, mom lived in rental housing, and so they think that's where they're going to end up. What we do is we watch our rental housing participants, and those that start bumping up against our ceiling rents, we then approach them and say, you seem to be at a level where you can obtain a home ownership status or a mortgage. We then offer our services through our homebuyer ed classes, and once we can get some economic stability, we can show that home ownership is a real goal for you. And we've done that for a lot of families. That is all built on the backbone of the tribe and its efforts under sovereignty for years have really pushed and led by example through our tribal leaders to show that anybody that had the capabilities of being a homeowner should aspire to be a homeowner.
For us to develop our capacity to lend, understand lending, and to have all of the products our members needed, as well as a way to support it, that it seemed like it made really good sense to look at a community bank. We actually had a company come in and evaluate the tribe as a bank owner. Does it make good business sense, or is it just a trophy? Does it make sense for the tribe to pursue a bank? And they said, yes, you are a good candidate to own a bank. You would be able to broaden your lending base because your members would feel comfortable coming out of tribal credit or working with tribal credit. It makes very good sense, business sense.
Eagle Bank is located in Polson, Montana. We are a small community bank, state chartered, and we are here to serve the residents of the community, specifically with a mandate to take care of the underbanked and unbanked. The bank is owned by S&K Bank Corp., which is a holding company which is owned by the tribe. So the tribe is essentially the only shareholder, but all of the members of the tribe are shareholders of the bank as well. The tribe really do work very hard to try to raise the standard of living, and part of that is home ownership. We have a common goal. We both want to see sound economic development on this reservation that benefits everyone. And where the bank comes into play is that we have the ability to facilitate that through a mortgage program. The number one most important product that we have specifically for tribal members is the HUD 184 mortgage program, which allows us to make high loan-to-value mortgages with a government guarantee to anyone who is a enrolled member of a federally recognized Indian tribe.
I had started watching the market, seeing what houses were available. I saw this house and we decided to put a bid on it. We started on the HUD 184 loan. Our home ownership coordinator, she was really good about helping me out with, figuring out the process because it's a big process. Part of our housing authority's services that they offer is they get an inspector out here. So an inspector was able to come out and make sure the house was safe. And now here we are. We own our house and we love it.
We all thought when the HASA passed, tribal leaders were going to jump in and take ownership of it. By and large, that hasn't happened. That's why I think Salish Kootenai's situation is very unique because it's so focused on self-determination and expectations. The tribal council does have some very high expectations, and that's what drives our home ownership. Their belief that the only way to truly be independent well into the future is to control their destiny by controlling finances, good jobs, stability, so that they can have a bright chance of survival.
So yeah, I think that was I liked that video, and I'm sorry that the audio wasn't better, where most people at least able to read the captions, which didn't always line up. I was looking Confederated Toshi instead of Salish, but yeah. Yeah, mole free. You don't want moles, kind of taking over your home. They're like termites, right? They're pests. But yeah, I think so. I see that we have about 20 minutes. 20 minutes left, and I want to give George some time to talk a little bit more about the compacting. So what I will say is I do have that it's not really a sign-up sheet. It's if you want a copy of the handbook, please give me your mailing address. That's more important even than your email. But I think what I'll do before passing it over to you, and just so I can give you the rest of the time, is that the handbook has resources of all the things that we have been talking about or hearing examples about from Chief Executive Melanie, from the nation that George is from. Those examples are in the book. We even have an example of Matt Carriaga, who's sitting here from Ho Chunk on Hearth as a case study. And we have other, like I said, examples and resources. And we keep talking about the HUD 184, and I know there was a session earlier, but this handbook also goes into more detail about other mortgage products like the USDA 502 Direct. The VA has a Native American direct loan. And then even Fannie Mae is in this space, and they have a conventional loan. So there are other options, and there are some that sometimes even work better than the HUD 184 because there are different eligibility criteria, and sometimes people are kind of over income. So that's something to look at. There are also housing needs assessments. We don't have time, but there are tribes that have kind of, when they're not sure where to start, the best place to start is with an assessment of, is there the demand? What type of homes are people looking for? What can they afford? And what does the tribe have the capacity to build? So today we're focused on that left-hand column. You know, what can tribal leaders do? And we've talked about these here. And then yesterday afternoon, I was with tribal housing authorities, and we talked about the right-hand side of the column in terms of like how do they actually do the program development. But those two, they should be connected. Yeah.
I think something important to note is that when you allow home ownership and these permanent improvements on tribal lands, is that enacting the laws, I think that's important because it's just not your leasing law or
Foreclosure and eviction.
foreclosure or eviction laws, because those are usually required by
HUD.
prior when your tribes get into Section 184. That's just the bare minimum. And I think what tribes need to understand and an issue down the road is how exactly are you going to regulate permanent improvements on the trust properties? Because once the loan is satisfied, and once the loan and the mortgage is satisfied, the BIA doesn't care about the improvements on the property. They don't regulate those improvements. The probate's done by the administrative law judges. Those are for trust interest. Those aren't for the improvements on the lands. So if a tribal member owns those improvements when they pass, those probates aren't going to cover the ownership and the succession of those improvements. So what tribes need to look at, and or the laws that they need to look at enacting, would be regulation of those improvements, creating a title system, because it's neither the state nor the feds. You don't want the counties regulating the ownership of those. You don't record a deed for trust property for those improvements at the county register of deeds. So that there's a void there where tribes need to either create an abstract or a torrents type system because you're essentially creating a market, you have equitable real estate here. You want tribal members to be able to come in and convey interests to each other, one another, or to the tribe, to allow these improvements to stay within tribal ownership. And you need to have the laws in place to allow that type of mechanism, either like a register of deeds office or these quit claims forms, and that they need to understand that the land itself is not what's being conveyed in these transactions. It's the permanent improvements on the land. So it's good to talk about this pre-education. There's a lot of learning that needs to happen, but also on the regulation side, there's also post-closing or post-satisfaction. If a tribal member wants to sell their home to another tribal member, then there needs to be that mechanism and those forms and those laws in place to regulate conveyance of permanent improvements and interest in those permanent improvements on your tribal lands.
Thank you, Matt. Quick follow-up question. Do you know of tribes that have that in place?
Well, we recently passed a title transfer and recording ordinance. It's still very early on, and it's probably about a year and a half old. But it allows tribal members to, when they create a permanent improvement, not just members, entities, when they create or develop or build permanent improvements on tribal trust lands, to apply for title to those improvements. So not only would they have title to the improvements, they'd also have a lease, because a lease does not grant title to improvements. A lease just allows you or allows the lessee to utilize that property for a specific reason on the premises. Usually comes in a form of legal description for a specific use for a specific time. It's not unrestricted, unlimited use. You're not conveying title in a lease. So you're not conveying, the only interest you're conveying is a leasehold interest to the individual or the lessee. And a mortgage does not also convey title interest. A mortgage is just a loan document, strictly financial. You can have provisions in a lease in regards to permanent improvements, which a lot of these leases do. You can construct a lease however you want. You can throw whatever provisions you guys agree to. And I'd suggest taking a look at your leases, especially post-HARF, post-162 update, and making sure you're in compliance and making those leases strong. I think that case law with Choctaw and Dollar General shows that when those consenting forms are signed by the parties, it's a powerful document for you. So we have a mortgage, we have a lease, and what we didn't have was that title document showing who exactly owns the interest to the permanent improvements. In a perfect world, all those documents would be the person taking out the loan would be the lessee and the title owner.
They can't hear unless we have the mic. No, thank you, Matt. I won't go too far because I do want to pass the mic to George. So just 1 second. But we are looking at the CICD like other land tenure systems and models. So in Canada, a lot of the First Nations are looking at this Torrens system and creating their own, registry and creating this that can be used by all First Nations. And we were asking them, well, what does that take to do it, and how do you get the political will behind it, not just the mechanisms. And they started even a system for how they're going to record all the land records and take those over from, I guess, whatever their equivalent to the BIA is. And it hurts my brain to think about how that might work. But there are other kind of indigenous communities thinking about that, and that might be something that they're thinking of trying to introduce here. So just thought that was of interest. And then I'm going to pass it over after this question.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I work for the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior Chippewa. According to the chart that you had before, we have one of the highest rates of 184 homes on tribal trust land. And in our land leases ordinance, it says that after the lease expires or terminates, the former lessee has 30 days to remove and restore the lease site, or the ownership of the property on the lease site transfers over to the tribe. That's not something that we That's not something we want to do exactly. We want to give the opportunity to tribal members to transfer the home to a purchaser or to a family member or what have you. But we do have that built into the code where there's a 30-day period that they have to remove the property from the lease site and restore the site, or the tribe can take over the ownership of the property on the lease site. So just wanted to add that to the conversation.
Oh, thank you. Let me see. Might not get that right. Amarin, thank you, from Red Cliff. No, that's a good example. And I don't know a ton about, like, and I was saying this yesterday about, like, leasing regulations and kind of that environment. So I leave it to experts. But that is a good example, too. So I think I'm going to pass this to George, because we just got about a little over 10 minutes. If you haven't filled out the session evaluations, please do. And then if you have to leave like hard and fast at noon, feel free. But yeah, I do want to hear more about kind of what you had done.
Okay, and part of a follow-up with your statement a bit ago, on our reservation, what we do with the leases is there's a lease successor form that how the lessee currently wants that to transfer, or you would do it through estate planning. Both of those would take care of that, not going back to the tribe or being put up for sale. Okay, as I stated before, George Ducharme from Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes. I'm the LTRO manager. Now, way back in the 80s and the 90s, the tribes started compacting the Bureau functions on the reservations, from forestry to education to health to everything the Bureau did on the reservation, we compacted. Now, the one thing we didn't have access to through compacting everything is our records. So we asked the Bureau for, could we get those records? No, those are our records. Those are federal records. And the tribe said, no, they're not. They're our records. They're associated with our people, our lands, their land dealings, their mortgages, their sales. And we couldn't get them. So the next step was, well, if we can't get our records, maybe we'll compact the records management system. So they thought, well, we'll compact the LTRO function. And first thing they did was put an ad in the paper for any tribal member willing to work as a title plant manager. And I didn't know what a title plant manager was. I was a forester. But I was due for a change. So I put in an application. And, I was selected. Well, I didn't know, before I applied, I thought, well, I'm going to go to the local county and talk to an abstract title company and say, hey, what does a title plant manager do? I had not a clue. So I went and sat with one of them, and he gave me a little what twos and what fours about it. And I thought, okay, I'll apply. So I did. I was selected, came to work, and first the Bureau said that you're not going to compact title. This is a federally fiduciary trust responsibility that can only be performed by the Bureau. Well, the tribes took exception and said, we don't buy that. How about a solicitor's opinion? So in Northwest Regional Office, you can use your solicitors. Well, their solicitors come back with an opinion that virtually said, yes, it was a compactable function and the tribes could compact it. And when the Northwest Regional Director heard that, Mr. Stanley Speaks was the director at the time. I guess it wasn't the regional director, that was the area director at the time, back in the 90s. And he said, well, if this is going to happen, my people are going to make sure that the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes succeed. So we're going to get behind this, and we will support you in every way we can. He went so far as to send his staff out to help me set up my office when I got back to the reservation. He says, I'll send 2 people out there and they will sit with you for a month and teach you how. So anyway, as soon as the tribes, I said that, they advertised for me. And I was selected to be the first and only tribal LTRO in the nation. I thought, that's pretty cool, wow. But the first day I got to work, they said, okay, pack your bags, you're going to Portland, Oregon, and you're going to learn how to be a title plant manager. So I went to Portland for about 2.5 months, and I sat at the desk of everybody that had anything to do with title, with record keeping, with the LTRO management office. They've got like a staff of 45. I sat at most of their desks. I learned how to record. I learned what a recordable document looked like. I learned the rules and regulations, the guidelines governing LTRO, and it was really a major undertaking. And this is more than I can handle. Very complex. All I ever get there, I had no idea. But my real, what I'm talking about here, my advice to you is if you plan on compacting or contracting title, and it can be done, but get your region to support you, go to them and get the training. You know, the Bureau's been doing this forever. This was new to me 20 years ago. You know, I know what it is today, but 20 years ago I had not a clue, and I was, whoa, I'm not going to get there. This is way too much. But it can be done. One thing that was something that was of interest was, you know, the Bureau, the Northwest Regional Office, they handle 45 plus reservations. The good thing was I just had my reservation. So the people that I served were my brothers, my sisters, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, my neighbors. So I did, you know, I was driven to do the best job I could, and I do. And those after we compacted, I called back home and I asked the chairwoman at the time, I said, you know, this is really a deep, vast arena that you put me in here. I said, leave me here for 6 months, a year. This is pretty heavy stuff. And she said, no, we're the tribe. We can do this better and faster than the Bureau. Just come on home and get to work. Do your job. So she says, and before you do that, says you go downtown, you rent yourself a U-Haul truck. You take that U-Haul truck and you back up to the regional office, and you load everything in that regional office that says Salish Kootenai, Flathead, 203, which is our red code, res code. Load that on that truck and bring them home. Bring our records home. And any equipment it takes to set up an LTRO office. Well, I got that U-Haul truck backed up to the regional office, and the regional LTRO staff loaded my truck. I think they were glad to get rid of us. But yeah, they loaded the truck, and I hauled all of those records home across, you know, probably illegal as hell, but across 4 state lines. You know, they said they were federal records, and here I am. So I got home and started looking at what we had and started setting up shop, and the leader said, well, where's your imaging? Where's your, you know, they filmed. The Bureau said microfilming, or, yeah, photo. Where's your photo equipment, microfilm photo equipment? The only way to capture a good record and long-lasting, that'll last forever, is microfilming, and that's all we do. And it's dual filming. You take 2 pictures of each record. Well, and the Bureau said, that's the only thing we'll accept. Well, the tribal council, my leaders, they said, no. You know, the the industry around here, why don't you go to the local counties and see what they use? Well, they always use the same kind of electronic imaging system. I went to 4 counties, 4 of the larger counties in Montana, and they all use the same brand. So I got approval and bought what they used. And I started electronic imaging 10 years before the Bureau ever thought of it. Nope, they said you can't do it, we won't accept it. We did it anyway. You know what the Bureau's using today? Electronic imaging in TAMS. You know, when I started, it wasn't TAMS. When I started, it was ELRIS, an ancient system. But it was really tough. But we got there. Now, being the first LTO in the nation, I had nobody to go to. But what I had, and I established when I went for my training, was a Bureau agency. The Northwest Regional Office were my friends. The Bureau is my friend. They're not my enemy. I used them through every step of what I did. I've never seen this document before. I didn't see one when I was in training. When I was in training, I only worked on Flathead, Salish, Kootenai documents. That's all I processed. I didn't process anybody's records. So I processed mortgages, leases, probates, everything under the sun. It was me. I got home, and the only one there to do all of this was me. And it was really scary and a tough job. Today I'm a crew of 2. And I'm about to retire, and she'll be a crew of 1 again. But it was really eye-opening. But you can do it, you know, get the Bureau behind you. Don't think you can do it alone. Every function that we compacted at Salish Kootenai, we kept the Bureau staff on. They had a lot of knowledge. They've been doing this for years. So we used them, and we through attrition, we replaced them with tribal members. All of it is tribal member operated today, with a few non-members with specialty educations that we had to have. But mostly it's all Bureau. And I'm dying of thirst, excuse me.
And if people are leaving, it's not because of you, it's just because we crunched on time.
No, it's lunchtime and they're all hungry. So anyway, what I'm saying is it can be done. Don't divorce the Bureau if you do it. They are an asset. They can help you. So go forth and do good things. You know, microfilm and cover that. I think I covered everything I was supposed to cover. And it can be done. Thank you. Again, if you are going to do it, my tribe says come up and visit my office and see what we do. We've got people here in the audience that came up. And we've got people in the audience that are going to be operating their LTRO next month. First next month.
Where are you from? Oh, very nice. Yeah. Charles Malloy spoke about Harvey next week.
So it can be done. And it's kind of nice to when that person is trying to get a mortgage, they need their TSR. That's my job. I get a request for a TSR. Me and my assistant will put out that TSR in an hour or less. Our titles were all certified before we took over, before we compacted the function. We asked the Bureau, bring those titles up to date, which they did. Not all of them were 100% accurate, but they did. It really lightened the load on me. I didn't have to go back and reinvent the wheel and start from the trust patent and bring it forward with every transaction from there to now. It was already done. So when that request for a TSR comes in, I do it in that minute, that hour. That mortgage comes in, it's recorded that day. It's sent off back to the bank that afternoon. So the time lag that you hear about in the Bureau is not there. If a person can't try to start a mortgage on the 1st of December, if I haven't got it through and done by the end of December, I'm slowing up. We can make things happen. You can make things happen. Title is very important. To wait for the Bureau to get it done can be timely. I'm not saying the Bureau isn't good, because they've been at it for years. I use the heck out of them, I really do. I've got a good rapport with them, and I maintain that rapport. They are my friend. Good day to you.
And if you have questions, feel free to come up if you have time. And otherwise, I didn't speak much to this, but there will be training for practitioners on the handbook in terms of just building out modules. So that if you're interested, go to the CICD website and you can subscribe to our communications and you'll get the update. Thank you so much, George. I mean, I have questions for you, so I'm sticking around.